I'm Travis.
And I'm Justin, and this is Lateral G's. Welcome to episode 5 of our 87 Integra project series.
We've got a lot of parts to install in this episode, so let's get to it. Alright, we're going to start off by disassembling this subframe and then replacing the wear items on it while cleaning it up.
We start by removing the sway bar and the engine mount.
Alright, now we're going to disassemble the entire torsion bar assembly on the front subframe. We start by removing the height adjusting nut and then the dust cap off of the rear of the torque tube. After that, we remove the snap ring off of the rear of the torsion bar. There's another snap ring on the front. To get to it, you remove a dust cover and then hammer the back of the bar and it sticks out the front of the control arm. There's just enough room to get to it with a screwdriver. All that brown gunk is the grease used during assembly. Now that both snap rings are off, you can pull the torque tube out of the back and then the torsion bar will slide right out of the front subframe.
We gathered up all the suspension parts, took an industrial strength degreaser and a Brillo pad and cleaned them all up.
Alright, we have our control arms removed from our subframe. We did this by just twisting the control arm and tearing the bushing out of there. But it left behind the inner and outer sleeves. These sleeves are pressed on, so it's going to require some grinding and cutting to get both of these out. Mainly to remove this excess bushing material that was left behind.
After the walls of the bushing sleeve were ground down thin enough, I was able to split it in half using a screwdriver and a hammer.
Finally!
Because we don't have a press, we heated up the bushings to push them out. This made it much easier to remove them. For some unknown reason, some of the bushings were much more flammable than the others.
Now I'm going to disassemble the front knuckle. I start by removing all 4 of the studs, since we're going to replace these later. Next, I use a bearing driver to push the hub out of the knuckle. Next, I remove the snap ring that holds the bearing in the knuckle. The snap ring pliers that I had on hand were too small, so I used a pair of needle nose pliers and ground down the tips to get this snap ring out. There were 3 screws to remove to get the dust shield off. Next, I used one of the spare control arms I had lying around to hammer the bearing out of the knuckle.
We used the wire wheel to grind down all the insides of the bushing wells and all the parts that had rust built up on them.
Once we had all the surfaces clean and everything was masked off, I went ahead and painted all the suspension components flat black. Earlier when we removed the lower control arm, the outside sleeve of the torsion bushing was left pressed in the subframe. I used a hacksaw to cut reliefs in the sleeve, and then I used a mallet and a crowbar to hammer the sleeve out of the subframe.
To replace all the old worn-out rubber bushings, we went to Energy Suspension to buy all of our new polyurethane bushings.
All of the bushings come with Energy Suspension's Formula 5 pre-lubricant that needs to be spread all around on the mating surfaces before the bushings are installed in the suspension components. The first bushings we installed were in the trailing arms. Next, we installed the bushings in the Panhard bar. The Panhard bar kit doesn't come with new metal sleeves like the trailing arm kit did, so we had to use the original sleeves in the old bushings. We set the bushings on fire and they just crumbled away. The last bushings we needed to install on this rear axle were the end links for the rear sway bar. The rear sway bar is a twist beam located inside of the rear axle, and it connects to the trailing arm to prevent body roll. Now that both trailing arms and the sway bar end link are attached to the rear axle, we attached the brake caliper mounting brackets and the Panhard bar. Now that all the pieces are on this rear axle, it's time to install it back on the car. I started by connecting the Panhard bar first, and then moving on to the trailing arms. It was a tight fit to squeeze the new bushings in the mounting locations. I put jack stands under the trailing arms and then pulled down on the rear axle to force the bushings into place. And now that the rear axle is installed,
That's all for this episode. Thanks for watching.
be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our page on Facebook.